Late summer, 359. Deep inside the upper Tigris Valley, a wall is coming down. The earth ramp the Persians have spent 50 days dragging up against the eastern rampart slides forward in the night, taking part of the rampart with it. The Roman officer on the catwalk feels the basalt go soft under his boots. Below him, in the breach, men in iron scale are already climbing. He drops his torch. He does not have time to scream. By the time the sun rises over the citadel of Amida, the second strongest Roman fortress on the Persian frontier, head of a province, seat of a bishop, the city Constantius II had personally reinforced 6 years earlier, will be a smoking shell. 73 days. That is how long the upper Tigris town, that nobody in Constantinople expected to hold a single week, held out against the largest Persian army the Sasanian dynasty had ever fielded on the western frontier. This is the story of how a Roman city, no bigger than a Mediterranean market town, stalled the Shahanshah Shapur II long enough to break his autumn campaign. It is the story of one ballista bolt that turned a routine siege into a war of extermination. And it is the story of a young Antiochian staff officer who climbed down a rope into the dark on the 73rd night, rode east through Persian patrols on a borrowed horse, and lived to write the only surviving account of what happened inside the wall. The whole of Book 19 of his Res Gestae belongs to those days. He sets it out the way a soldier writes a report after the fact, not the way a courtier writes a panegyric. Early in the work, he tells the reader, in a methodological aside, that he has set down, like a man laying out a tabular ledger, whatever he himself saw, or whatever he learned by close questioning of those personally involved. Tabular. Like an accountant's ledger. That is the temperament of the only Roman who wrote this siege from inside the wall. You should picture the man, because everything we know about Amida runs through him. His name was Ammianus Marcellinus. He was not yet 30. He was a protector domesticus on the staff of the Magister Equitum per Orientum, the cavalry commander of the East, a job his teachers in Antioch would have understood, the closest thing the late Roman army had to a young officer with a notebook and a pair of working eyes. He was Greek-speaking, Antiochian, from a curial family. He wrote in Latin because that was the language of the army he had served for 10 years. He liked Cicero, distrusted emperors, and quoted Homer at moments where another writer would have quoted a regulation. Modern scholars are split on him. Roger Blockley reads him as a careful documentarian who occasionally reaches for an Iliadic register because that is his literary range. John Matthews reads him as a working soldier who knew that the only way to make Latin readers feel the death of a Persian prince at the foot of a basalt wall was to drop a half-line of Greek behind it. Eileen Matthews. The man knew what he had seen. By the count he gives, and his is the only count we have, because the Sasanian regnal reliefs at Naksh-e-Rustam do not record how many small kings buried how many sons at the foot of an Armenian city wall, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people were inside Amida when the siege began. 7 Roman legions, plus the cavalry detachments that had retreated into the town as the Persian column moved north, plus the entire civilian population of the province who had fled in through the gates the week before. The town was built for half that. By the second week of the siege, the streets stank of what too many people in too small a space stank of in the 4th century. By the 5th week, plague was killing more defenders than the bolts. By the 7th, the Persian engineers had brought up siege engines from the workshops of Ctesiphon that the Magister Equitum's officers had only ever heard described in letters from the frontier. To understand why this town mattered, you have to look at the map. Amida, the modern city is Diyarbakir, in southeastern Turkey, sits on a black basalt plateau on the right bank of the upper Tigris. The walls were basalt too, thick, dark, almost untrimmed, set on a cliff that drops 30 meters to the river. From the citadel, you could see east into the Sasanian highlands and west into the Roman valleys of Sophanene and Anzitene, two of the small Armenian principalities Rome held by treaty. The town sat astride the only good road from Persia into Roman Armenia. It was, in Constantius's mind, the bolt on the door. If Amida held, the Persian column could not winter on the Roman side of the Tigris. If Amida fell, every fortified town between the upper Tigris and the Euphrates was open to a Persian army that had 3 months of campaigning weather left. Constantius had personally reinforced the place 6 years before. The emperor was not a soldier the way his cousin Julian would later be a soldier. He was a man of the curia and the secretarial bureau, awkward in saddle and shy in council. But he understood that the eastern frontier was the only frontier on which he was likely to lose his throne to something other than a usurper, and he had run the east on a kind of stubborn caution since the 340s. He had stationed in Amida 6 regular Roman legions, the 5th Parthica, the 10th Fortes, the Magnentiaci and Decentiaci, and the Superventores, together with the Preventores, plus the Comitatensian units that gave the city its day-to-day garrison, plus an irregular cavalry called the Comites Sagittarii Persae, made up of Persian deserters who had thrown in with Rome a generation earlier. 2 of these names carry their own hedge. The Magnentiaci and the Decentiaci had been raised by the western usurper Magnentius in his short-lived bid for the purple in the early 350s. After Mursa, Constantius had broken Magnentius and shipped his surviving units east as a kind of punishment posting. Keep your standards, lose your homeland, fight under the man who killed your patron. They had been on the eastern frontier for 6 or 7 years by the summer of 359, professional, hard, and quietly furious. They nursed grievances Ammianus does not bother to spell out, because anyone in his readership would have understood them. In the 2nd month of the siege, the Gallic units of Amida were going to ask the commes of the city for something no chronicler should have to record. The commes was going to grant it. That is a story for the 2nd part of this account, and I will hold it there. What the chronicle keeps coming back to in Book 19 is one machine, a ballista on the eastern tower. Roman artillery officers called the smaller versions of these engines scorpiones, torsion-wound horizontal bows that threw an iron-tipped bolt the length of a man's forearm with enough force to drive it through a layered scale cuirass at 200 paces. The garrison kept several of them along the eastern rampart, mounted on platforms cut into the basalt, with hand-picked crews who slept under the boards in shifts. The crews had standing orders: do not fire at a parley, do not fire at a banner of truce, do not fire at anyone in royal-scale armour. The standing orders were a courtesy to the Shahanshah of Persia, who was known to negotiate in person and was known not to forgive theatre. In the 3rd week of the siege, in a parley that was supposed to end the war, before either side committed itself to the long winter, one of those crews would forget every protocol the Eastern Command had ever issued. They would traverse their weapon 30 degrees to the right. They would pull the lever. The bolt would go through the gilded scale on the chest of a young man on horseback at the edge of the Persian line. That young man turned out to be the only son of Grumbates, king of the Chionitai, the most powerful of Shapur's allies on this campaign. After that there was no parley. After that the siege was personal, and Grumbates was the one who would name the price. The price would be the entire city. To understand how one bolt produced 73 days of slaughter, you have to understand what the Roman East had been doing wrong for a generation, what the man on the Persian throne had been quietly preparing to do about it for 30 years, and what bad luck, or the kind of luck that looks like fate to a man writing it down after the fact, put a young Greek staff officer with a notebook on the only staff that watched it all unfold. By the late 350s, the Roman East was running on stubborn caution and not much else. The frontier had been bleeding men for a generation, and the empire had been losing the kind of fights that do not appear on triumphal inscriptions. Small towns burned, hostages sent east, treaties signed and quietly broken on the next campaigning season. Constantius II had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to hold a line on the upper Tigris that his father, Constantine the Great, had drawn after the peace of 298, a peace that had given Rome 5 small trans-Tigritane principalities, a line of fortified Roman towns on the upper Tigris with Nisibis and Singara as the heaviest bolts on the door, and the kind of strategic depth no Roman emperor had enjoyed in the east since Septimius Severus. By 359, most of that depth was gone. Constantius had lost Nisibis 3 times in the 340s and held it by miracle and an Antiochene bishop named Jacob. He had lost Singara in 348. He had spent more than a decade managing a war against a king who, by all reasonable Sasanian custom, should already have been dead. Shapur II was the Persian problem made flesh. He had been crowned in his mother's womb. The story sounds like later embroidery, but the Persian succession ritual really did set the imperial diadem on the belly of a pregnant queen after the death of her husband, Hormizd II, in 309, and the boy born from that bed reigned for 70 years. By 359, he was somewhere in his 49th or 50th year. The Eastern sources count differently from the Western. Sasanian regnal years begin at the moment of the womb coronation, not at the moment of accession to full power, and you have to read 3 chronicles next to each other before you commit to a number. He had been king longer than any soldier in his army had been alive. He had grown up in the world of Persian noble factions in the long minority that followed his coronation, learned to ride before he could walk, learned to kill noble rivals before he could read, and by his late teens he had begun the slow, deliberate work of building a state his father had only ever administered. He had a free hand on the eastern frontier of his own empire because he had spent the 350s breaking the Khayanite and the other steppe peoples on the Khorasan border into a coalition. Where Roman generals talked about subduing barbarians, Shapur preferred to absorb them. He had given Grumbates, king of the Khayanite, the household honours and standing of an ally of the House of Sasan. He had paid the Albanian princes north of the Caspian in silver drams stamped at Ctesiphon. By the spring of 359, he had brought a coalition into the field that included the regular sparbed cavalry of Iran, his own armoured cataphracti called the Savaran, the elephant corps of Messene, the Chianite horse archers under Grumbates, Albanian heavy infantry, Jelani spearmen, and a baggage train pulled by camels that stretched, by Ammianus's own count of the road, from a Roman watchtower for 60 Roman miles. 60 miles. That is a column moving on more than one road, in waves, over a week. He had also, the year before, acquired one more asset. His name was Antoninus, and he was a Roman. Antoninus had been a protector domesticus on the staff of the Dux Mesopotamiae. He spoke Latin and Persian and Aramaic. He had spent 12 years on the eastern frontier, knew the road network from Antioch to Nisibis, the way a Sasanian noble knew the road from Ctesiphon to Ver Ardashir, and had been ruined by a tax case that the Dux refused to dismiss. In the early spring of 358, he had crossed the Tigris with his family and gone to the Persian court at Ctesiphon. Shapur had given him an estate, an annual pension, and a chair in council during military planning. Ammianus, who had served on Ursicinus's staff while Antoninus was on the Dux's, never forgave him. He calls him in the Res Gestae a deserter. Then a few paragraphs later, in a passage that Roger Blockley reads as grudging professional respect. An officer whose intelligence __0__. Two voices in 3 sentences. Ammianus did that often. He let his anger and his accuracy share a paragraph and forced the reader to choose. We will see Antoninus again in this account, standing at Shapur's right shoulder, pointing at a section of basalt wall. Hold him in mind. The Magister Equitum per Orientem, who was supposed to coordinate the Roman response, was Ursicinus, an Illyrian cavalry officer in his 60s, the kind of soldier Constantius II distrusted on instinct, because Constantius II distrusted competent generals on instinct. Ursicinus had served the emperor honorably in 3 wars, broken Magnentius's last redoubts in the Western Alps, run the Eastern Command for several years, and made a number of dangerous enemies at the consistory in Milan. By the spring of 359, his enemies had persuaded the emperor that Ursicinus was about to do what every successful Eastern general before him had done, which was to put on the purple. So Ursicinus was recalled to court. Then, when news of the Persian movements reached Milan, he was sent back. Then, when news of his return reached the eunuchs of the consistory, his command was given over to a courtier named Sabinianus, an elderly Mesopotamian aristocrat who had spent the previous decade administering the imperial estates around Antioch and had never in his life seen a Persian army from less than 100 miles away. That arrangement is the second great Roman failure of the campaign. Ursicinus was on the ground. He knew the country. He had the trust of his staff. He had the personal acquaintance of every Cumes, commanding every fortified town from the Euphrates to the Tigris. But the field command rested with Sabinianus, who sat in Edessa, drinking spiced wine and going to memorial services in cemeteries. Ammianus, on this subject, drops the tabular voice and lets a sentence of genuine venom into the prose. He calls Sabinianus a man who paid more attention to the dead than to the living. Whether Ammianus was being literal, there really were memorial services at Edessa that summer for the noble dead of earlier campaigns, or whether he was making a metaphor about a commander who functioned like a man already in his own tomb, he does not say. I read the passage twice before I noticed that he was making both jokes at once. The Persian column crossed the lower Tigris at the start of June. Shapur intended, by his initial plan, to march straight on Nisibis and finish the work of the 340s. A pair of deserters from the Roman side, Antoninus among them, although Ammianus calls his colleague Craugasius by name and not by deed, talked him out of it. Nisibis, they explained, had been reinforced again. Singara had been reinforced. The straight road through northern Mesopotamia was now lined with fortified towns whose garrisons had been hardened by 20 years of war. There was a better road. Cross to the right bank of the Tigris higher up. Move north into Sophonin. Take Amida. From Amida, you could winter on the Roman side of the river without having to crack a single major fortress. Once Amida fell, the others would follow. Shapur considered the advice and changed the campaign. He sent forward a screening force to seize the small fortresses of Riemann and Busan, both of which surrendered after a day, and gave their populations to Grumbates as a courtesy. Then he turned the column north toward the upper Tigris. Ammianus was caught on the wrong side of that turn. Ursicinus had sent him, in late May, on a mounted scouting mission across the Tigris with one of the local nobles, a man named Jovinian, to check on the loyalty of the satraps in the trans-Tigritane regions. They were riding back toward Nisibis when the Persian column began moving along a road that should have been empty. They saw the dust first. Then the head of the column, Persian heavy cavalry, mailed from helmet to greaves, riding past in silence in the white midday heat. Ammianus and Jovinian threw themselves into a vineyard, watched the column pass, then rode east through country they did not know, in order to come into Amida from the side the Persians had not yet sealed. They reached the gates of the city on a borrowed horse, with the column already in sight on the southern road. Ursicinus was inside the walls. The cordon closed 2 days later. From that moment until the morning of the breach, the staff officer with the notebook was in the same trap as everybody else. The cordon closing in late June was a slow, ceremonial thing. The Persian column did not simply surround the city. It laid out its camps the way a Sasanian protocol manual would have prescribed, with the elephants of Messene to the south, the Albanians and Gilani to the north, the Chianite horse archers to the east, the Persian regulars in the center, and the king's own pavilion on a hill to the west, where the sun set behind the citadel and the silk of the awning could be seen from inside the wall. Shapur himself rode the perimeter on the third day. He was wearing the gold ram-headed crown of the Sasanian house and a scale cuirass painted in lapis blue. He carried no shield. He was, by every diplomatic signal a 4th century king could send, presenting himself for embassy. By the custom of these wars, a city in his position now produced its envoys, paid an indemnity, surrendered its hostages, and watched the column move on. The men on the wall did not produce envoys. The commes commanding Amida was a man named Ammianus, a hard career officer who had been a centurion in the Gallic legions in the 330s and had risen, in the way men of his kind sometimes did, on competence alone. Ammianus had read the standing orders the consistory had drafted for fortress towns in his position, and they were not orders he was inclined to read flexibly. Amida was to be held. So Amida was held. On the 4th day, Shapur sent a herald to the wall to call for surrender. Ammianus sent the herald back with the kind of polite refusal a Roman officer used when he was not yet ready to say no, in language Persian heralds would carry back uncensored. On the 5th day, Shapur rode close to the wall himself. This is the moment Ammianus circles around in Book 19, the way a man circles around a wound that has not yet healed. The Shahanshah was, by his own custom, expecting the embassy that did not come. He rode within bowshot of the eastern rampart, accompanied by his standard-bearers and by a small group of allied kings in their own scale armor. Grumbates of the Chionidae was on his right. Grumbates' only son, Ammianus does not give his name. The Chionidae left no records that have come down to us, and the man's father did not want his name spoken after what happened next, was on his left. The young man was perhaps 20. He was wearing the gilded scale armor of the Chianite royal household. He had a composite bow at his saddle and a long sword on his hip. He had ridden with his father in the breaking of the steppe peoples on the Khorasan border 3 years before. He was, in the careful phrase the chronicler uses, considerable in the household of his people. The Roman crew on the eastern tower had their orders. Do not fire at the parley. Do not fire at the royal banner. Do not fire at scale armor of the Sasanian colors. They had been watching the king ride his perimeter for 3 days. They had a torsion wound Scorpio mounted on the platform, an iron-tipped bolt loaded and locked. The chief artillerist on that crew was a man whose name no source preserves. Manuscripts disagree on whether he was a Gallic veteran from one of the Magnentiaci or a local recruit from the Sophanine levy. What he did, in front of every man on the eastern wall, was something nobody on that tower had been told he could do. He waited for the riding party to come within 200 paces. He sighted on the figure in lapis blue scale armor at the Shahanshah's left hand. He traversed the weapon 30 degrees. He pulled the lever. The bolt went through the gilded chest plate. It came out at the back of the saddle. The young man fell forward, then sideways, then off the horse onto the dust of the Tigris road. Grumbates was riding too close behind him to swerve in time. He dismounted before the body had stopped moving. The Shahanshah, by the same chronicle, did not move at all for a moment that Ammianus describes with the kind of attention a man gives to the silence after a thunderclap. The Sasanian court ritual for the death of an allied king's son had not been invoked in living memory. There was no precedent for what was supposed to happen next. What happened next was Grumbates kneeling in the road with his son's head in his lap and saying nothing for a very long time. The next 7 days, Ammianus says, the Chionitai did the funeral rites of their people inside their own camp. They built a pyre of cypress wood brought up from the river bottom. They washed the body in wine. They burned the dead prince with his armor on and his weapons in his hands. They sang the songs their warriors sang for warriors who died with bows in their hands and never reached them. Ammianus, who could not have witnessed any of this and says so plainly, quote 1, is unusually generous to the enemy in those passages. He calls the songs noble. He does not gloss them. He uses the same word for them that he uses for the songs Roman soldiers sang at funerals of comrades. If the late Roman East interests you, the chronicles, the maps, the small decisions that lost provinces, the way one weapon on one tower changes a campaign, this is the work the channel does. The chronicle of the next 2 months is sitting where you would expect it to sit, and the next episode is already there. Back to the wall and to the price. When the 7th day of mourning was over, Grumbates went to the Shahanshah's pavilion. The two of them spoke for an afternoon. We do not get the words. We get the result. Shapur sent a herald to the eastern wall and demanded the city. Not for tribute, not for indemnity, not for hostages, but for the body of the man who had killed his ally's only son, and for everyone who had stood near him on the platform when he did. Aelianus refused. He could not have done otherwise without losing the wall in the same hour. The herald rode back. The Persian engineers came forward with their measuring rods and their wicker baskets, and the men on the eastern rampart watched them begin to lay out, in stakes and ropes along the dust of the road, the shape of an earth ramp that would take 50 days to build, and would, on the 73rd day, slide forward in the night and take the rampart with it. The ramp went up over 50 days. It was, by every standard the chronicle uses, a piece of Sasanian field engineering on the scale of a small project at Ctesiphon. The Persians dug into the dry stream beds southeast of the city, hauled earth in wicker baskets on the shoulders of column labourers, cribbed the slope with felled cypress and oak from the river bottom, faced the riverside of the ramp with stones turned over from the road. They worked in shifts. The chronicle says the work continued at night under torches. On the wall, the Roman officers counted the torches in lines. By the manuals of fortification, a working party of so many lights meant so many men, and by the 3rd week, the count was running into the thousands. Aelianus had the eastern catapult batteries adjusted to drop bolts along the lines of torchlight. The chronicle says the bolts killed many. The lines kept moving. In the 2nd week of the siege, the elephants of Messene came forward. There were 10 of them. Sasanian war elephants of this period carried a small wooden tower on the back from which 2 or 3 archers shot down at men on a wall. They were used as much for the sound and the smell and the breaking of horses on the Roman side as for any direct attack. The Roman Scorpios on the eastern tower, the same machines that had killed the king's only son, were now firing at the elephants. Ammianus says the crews learned, by the 3rd day, that the place to put a bolt was the unarmoured patch on the inside of the foreleg, where the joint flexed. 2 of the elephants were brought down that way before Shapur ordered the others withdrawn. A Persian cataphract officer was crushed under the 2nd of them when it fell. The chronicle records the man by name, Nasps, of the household of the king. and admits, in one of those clear-eyed sentences Ammianus does often, that the bolt that killed the elephant was probably aimed at the man and missed. The Gallic legions were quiet for a month. The Magnentiarchi and Decentiarchi held a section of the western wall away from the artillery exchange, and Aelianus left them there because their tribunes, the bitter veterans of Magnentius's old western army, had been in a sourer mood every week as the siege ran on. In the second month, they came forward together to the praetorium and asked the comes for permission to do something. No source records what they asked in their own words. We have only Aelianus's answer. He granted what they asked. He ordered them to go out by night, through a low postern in the curtain wall on the side the Persians were not watching, to fall on the Persian camp at the part of the perimeter held by the elephants and the cataphracti, to do what damage they could, and to come back if they could come back. 300 Magnentiarchi and Decentiarchi went out that night under their senior tribune. They came back, by Ammianus's count, with about 120. They had cut their way into the cataphract horse lines and killed a man Shapur had personally trained as one of his officers. The next morning, the Persian camp doubled its night watches and built a second palisade between its lines and the city. The Gallic legions did not ask permission for a second sally. They had earned what they had wanted to earn, which Ammianus does not name, and I will not put words into his mouth about, and they spent the rest of the siege on the western wall in a kind of stillness that the chronicler clearly understood and did not bother to gloss for his Latin readers. In the 5th week, the plague came. Ammianus, who was a careful enough soldier to keep his report on the medical disasters of a 4th century city, separate from his report on the military disasters, devotes a long passage in Book 19 to it. He calls it a corruption of the air. He lists the symptoms. Fever first, then dysentery, then in the worst cases what he calls a bloody flux, that killed in 2 or 3 days. He says it was carried by the heat and the foul water and the bodies that had not been buried fast enough. He also says, and this is the passage that has held up best under modern epidemiological reading, that the bodies of the dead were burned in the open courtyards of the houses because there was nowhere to take them, and that the smoke from the burning hung in the city for 10 days without lifting. The plague killed, by the count he gives, several thousand inside the wall before it burned itself out at the start of the 6th week, when a clean north wind off the mountains finally moved the air. It was around the end of the 6th week that the Persian deserter Antoninus came forward to Shapur's pavilion and pointed at a section of the eastern wall. The section he pointed at was not the section the Romans had expected him to point at. The obvious weak spot, the one the Roman officers themselves had been reinforcing for 2 months, was a stretch of curtain near the southern gate where the basalt had been quarried thinner during the Constantian renovation of 353. Antoninus pointed instead at a section higher up, on the eastern face, where the wall ran along a natural shelf in the basalt, and where the stones had been mortared on top of older Hellenistic foundations from the Seleucid town that had once stood on the same plateau. The shelf, he said, was hollow. There were storerooms cut into the basalt under the rampart. If the ramp could be aligned with that shelf instead of with the curtain proper, the weight of the ramp itself, when it slid forward, would crack the basalt shelf inward and pull the wall down on top of the storerooms. Ammianus refuses Antoninus the name in this passage. The res gestae refers, with what reads now as a deliberate refusal of personal naming, to one whose advice was known. Ammianus knew who he was talking about, and he wanted the reader to know without granting the man the dignity of having his name spoken twice in the same paragraph. The Persians began the realignment of the ramp on the 44th day of the siege. They added a second slope, lower and longer, that came at the shelf from the east-southeast. They cribbed the new slope more heavily because the angle was now putting more lateral pressure on the basalt face than the original line. On the 48th day, they pushed the ramp forward by 10 paces. The Chronicle, in a passage Roger Blockley reads as Ammianus enjoying himself, says that on that night, the cribbing on the lower slope failed under the weight. The earth slid sideways into the trench between the ramp and the wall, and 200 or 300 Persian working labourers were buried alive in the slide. The Chronicle records the screams. It records the Sasanian officers ordering the survivors back to work before the bodies could be dug out. By morning, the slope had been rebuilt over the buried men. Modern military historians, on the rare occasions they discuss this campaign, treat that paragraph as one of the few unambiguously contemporary records of mass burial during active siege construction in the late antique world. For the next 25 days, the Romans tried to mine. They sank a shaft from the inside of the eastern rampart, ran a gallery out under the shelf, and shored it with cypress beams to bring down the Persian ramp from below. The Persians, who had been doing this kind of work since the days of Ardashir, heard the digging and sank a countershaft. The two galleries met somewhere under the ramp in the second week of the 9th month. The day is not recorded. He says only that the meeting was in the dark, that there was no banner of truce because nobody had brought a banner of truce that far underground, and that the Roman party of 12 men returned with 3. The Persian gallery was then collapsed by its own engineers as a precaution. The Roman gallery was sealed at the inner end. The mining stopped. The ramp went on. On the 72nd day, the ramp was finished. The Persian engineers spent the daylight hours of the 73rd packing the inner slope with men, ladders, and the long planks they used to bridge the last gap between a ramp and a wall. The Roman officers on the eastern tower could see, by the light of the setting sun, the working parties moving into position. Ammianus called his staff to the citadel. By the Chronicle, he gave them 3 orders. Hold the eastern wall as long as the artillery could fire. Burn the records of the praetorium so that the names of the local magistrates would not be found and used against their families in the deportations that would follow. And get out one officer with a written account in his own hand of what had happened, so that the empire would know how the second strongest fortress on the Persian frontier had fallen and why. Ursicinus, sitting outside the cordon at Edessa under Sabinianus's veto, had sent in 2 months earlier, through a sympathetic local nobleman, a man whose name Ammianus does protect, a coded message asking that one of his own staff officers be among those who got out. He named the officer. Ammianus, when the orders came down on the night of the 73rd day, knew who he meant. So Ammianus Marcellinus, the protector domesticus with the notebook, was put with 2 companions on the side of the citadel that faced the river. They climbed down a rope. They reached the bank in the dark. They took horses tied at the foot of the cliff by the same sympathetic nobleman. They rode east through the country the Persians had not yet sealed, because the Persians were all looking at the eastern wall. That is why we have the res gestae. That is why we have any account of any of this at all. The wall came down sometime in the second watch. The Chronicle's account of what followed is famously dry. Ammianus uses the language of a regimental returns clerk filing a casualty report. The eastern ramparts slid inward across about 30 paces of frontage. Persian heavy infantry came in over the broken stones in their first cohort with the standard of the king's household carried in the centre. The second cohort came in behind them with torches. The third came in with the elephants. The basalt of the inner streets of Amida, which had been laid in the time of Constantius Chlorus, ran with what the Chronicle calls a slurry of blood and oil and burning straw, ankle-deep at the corners of the streets, for the rest of that night and the better part of the following day. Ammianus formed his last 100 men at the steps of the cathedral. The bishop of Amida, his name is not recorded, and I will not invent one for him, was at the altar. They were taken alive. Ammianus and his 5 senior officers were impaled on the road south of the gate. The chronicle records this in one sentence. The 2 Gallic legions, the Magnentiarchy and the Decentiarchy, were singled out for special treatment by Shapur's officers, partly because of the night sally that had killed the king's cataphract trainer, partly because of the political archive they carried in their unit standards, which still showed Magnentius's monogram under the imperial overlay, and were crucified along the road in a column that stretched, by the later Armenian tradition that preserves the most detail about the deportations, for a Roman mile. The bishop was dragged out of the church and executed on the cathedral steps. The surviving civilian population, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people by Ammianus's count, was marched east toward Khuzestan, where Shapur had been quietly resettling captured Roman populations since the 260s, and where the city, later known as Gunde-Shapur, founded under the Middle Persian name that meant, quote, two, was already growing on land his great-grandfather had given to the Roman prisoners taken from Valerian a century earlier. This is where the chronicle and the modern argument over what it means start to come apart. Roger Blockley, in his work on Ammianus's strategic vocabulary, reads the bolt that kills Grumbates' son as a deliberate Iliadic echo. Patroclus struck down at the foot of a wall, the father's wrath setting the rest of the Iliad in motion. He notes that Ammianus uses the verb the Latin Homeric translators used for the death of Patroclus, that the rhythm of the sentence imitates the famous Homeric line, by 1 foot, and he argues that the historian has shaped the moment of the bolt into a Greek literary frame for a Latin readership. John Matthews, in the standard monograph on the res gestae, argues the other way. Ammianus, he points out, reaches for Homeric register in passages where no one is dying. The description of a Persian camp at dawn, the layout of a parade ground at Antioch, the speech a tribune gives to a tired cavalry detachment outside Mosul. It is his register. It is not a singular flourish. The bolt that killed Grumbates' son was a bolt. The fact that Ammianus heard the line of the Iliad in it does not